Well, they had a lot of problems at that time, with a lot of crime and stuff. And that's one of the reasons that I was able to keep my kids at home. I know Michael always complained, but he never did have a childhood. He had a wonderful childhood. Why I say that? Because his childhood, he was there with his brothers and sisters. He always played with them. I just didn't want him out there playing with the kids and stuff that always in the trouble.
Watch enough footage of Michael Jackson performing and a strange pattern starts to emerge, one that has nothing to do with the music itself. Every movement lands exactly where it is supposed to land. Every beat of choreography arrives on time. Every vocal run resolves precisely where the arrangement calls for it. Every gesture, down to the tilt of a hat or the snap of a wrist, looks rehearsed to a degree that borders on mechanical, and yet somehow still reads as pure feeling rather than pure technique. Most people watching simply call this genius and move on. Fewer people ask where that particular kind of genius actually comes from, the specific, obsessive, almost frightened relationship with precision that made Michael Jackson incapable of allowing a single element of a performance to be anything less than exact. This is not a story about a father's cruelty in isolation. It is a story about what happens inside a child's developing mind when love, safety, and applause all become conditional on flawless execution, and what that child carries forward, for the rest of his life, once flawless execution becomes the only version of himself he ever learned how to trust. Psychologists who study perfectionism generally distinguish between two different sources of it, one rooted in genuine internal ambition, a person who sets high standards for themselves out of curiosity or pride, and another rooted in fear, a person who sets impossibly high standards because they learned early that anything less invited punishment, rejection, or withdrawal of love. Michael Jackson's own descriptions of his childhood rehearsals point unmistakably toward the second category. He did not describe a father who set high expectations and rewarded effort generously when those expectations were met. He described a father who treated any deviation from perfection as an offense requiring physical correction, a system in which the only acceptable outcome was flawlessness, and anything short of flawlessness carried real, immediate, bodily consequences. Children raised inside that kind of system do not typically grow into adults with a healthy, flexible relationship to achievement. They grow into adults for whom the pursuit of perfection becomes inseparable from the pursuit of basic safety, where a mistake is never simply a mistake, but a potential threat to be avoided at nearly any cost. Watching Michael Jackson's meticulous, almost compulsive attention to every visual and sonic detail of his later work through this lens reframes something audiences long celebrated as pure artistic dedication into something more complicated, a survival strategy learned in a rehearsal room in Gary, Indiana decades before anyone called him the king of pop. This dynamic helps explain one of the more puzzling aspects of Michael's adult career, the way he approached the recording and production of his music with a level of obsessive revision that colleagues and producers described as extraordinary even by the standards of an industry already known for demanding perfectionists. Engineers who worked with him across multiple decades recalled sessions where a single vocal take would be recorded dozens of times over, not because earlier takes were technically flawed in any way an ordinary listener could detect, but because Michael himself sensed some imperceptible imperfection that had to be corrected before he would allow the track to move forward. This kind of behavior gets celebrated, understandably, as the mark of an artist unwilling to compromise on quality, and there is genuine truth in that framing. But it sits alongside a darker possibility that deserves equal attention, that a child taught his worth was measured entirely by flawless execution grew into an adult who could not fully separate artistic quality from a much older, much more primal fear of consequence, so that even decades after leaving his father's house, the studio itself may have functioned, on some psychological level, as another rehearsal room where anything less than perfect still felt dangerous in a way no ordinary creative standard would explain. The physical dimension of this story extends further than most audiences realize, into territory that connects directly back to childhood in ways that are difficult to discuss but impossible to responsibly ignore. Michael's changing physical appearance over the decades became one of the most publicly scrutinized and often mocked aspects of his entire life. Endless tabloid speculation about surgeries, about his relationship with his own body, about what exactly he was trying to achieve or escape through those changes. Very little of that coverage seriously engaged with the psychological context that might explain it. A child whose physical performance was scrutinized, corrected, and punished from the earliest years of memory, whose body was quite literally the mechanism generating his family's income and his father's approval, does not necessarily grow into an adult with an uncomplicated, secure relationship to his own physical self. Some who studied his later life have suggested that his well-documented struggles with body image and his repeated pursuit of physical alteration may trace back, at least in part, to that same childhood dynamic, a lifelong difficulty trusting that his body, exactly as it was, could ever be considered good enough without intervention or correction, a belief instilled decades earlier by a father who rarely, if ever, communicated that Michael's natural talent and appearance were already sufficient. On their own terms. The isolation that came to define so much of Michael's adult life also traces back, more directly than most coverage acknowledged, to the specific texture of his childhood rather than simply the generic pressures of fame that affect many performers. Michael himself repeatedly described never having had an ordinary childhood, never having played outside with other children the way his peers did, never having the unstructured, unsupervised time that most people look back on as foundational to learning basic social skills and a stable sense of identity outside of performance. A child whose entire early life was organized around rehearsal, travel, and public appearance does not have the same opportunities most people take for granted to develop a self that exists independently of an audience's approval. This may help explain why Michael, even at the absolute peak of his global fame, surrounded by more attention than almost any human being in history has ever received, described persistent, profound loneliness in numerous interviews across decades. He had, in a very real sense, never been given the chance to develop an identity separate from performance, separate from the exacting standards his father had imposed on him before he was even old enough to form long-term memories of anything else. Neverland Ranch, filled with children and animals and rides, reads very differently once understood through this lens, less as an eccentric superstar's playground and more as an adult's earnest, if ultimately troubled, attempt to build the unstructured, judgment-free childhood environment he had never been permitted to experience himself, populated specifically with the one demographic, children, who had no memory of him as anything other than exactly who he presented himself to be in that moment. Trust itself became one of the most consistently damaged areas of Michael's adult psychology, and this too connects directly back to the specific conditions of his upbringing rather than simply the generic paranoia that sometimes accompanies extreme fame. A child raised by a father who could be affectionate and encouraging one moment and physically punishing the next learns, at a deep and largely unconscious level, that the people closest to him cannot be relied upon for consistent safety, that affection and danger can arrive from the exact same source with little warning. This kind of early relational pattern often creates lasting difficulty with trust in adulthood, a tendency either toward excessive guardedness or, somewhat paradoxically, toward excessive and sometimes poorly calibrated trust in people who present themselves as safe. Precisely because the internal compass for distinguishing genuine safety from danger was never properly calibrated during the years when it should have developed. Michael's adult life included both patterns at different points, periods of extreme reclusiveness and guardedness toward outsiders, alongside periods where he extended significant trust and access to people whose motives, in hindsight, did not always serve him well. Neither pattern exists in isolation from the other, and both plausibly trace back to a childhood in which the people who were supposed to represent unconditional safety, his own parents, had instead taught him that safety was always conditional, always dependent on performance, and could be withdrawn without warning the moment a standard was not met. What makes this psychological reading of the story especially difficult to sit with is how directly it complicates the easy narrative of triumph that so much popular coverage of Michael Jackson still defaults to, the idea that whatever difficulties he faced, he ultimately overcame them, channeling pain into genius and emerging victorious on the world stage. There is truth in that framing, and it would be dishonest to deny the extraordinary scope of what he actually achieved artistically. But trauma of the kind Michael described does not simply convert cleanly into triumph and then disappear. It tends to persist alongside achievement, shaping decisions, relationships, and self-perception for an entire lifetime, regardless of how many records are sold or how many awards accumulate on a shelf. The same perfectionism that produced some of the most meticulously crafted music and choreography in popular history also likely contributed to periods of genuine psychological suffering that had little to do with external circumstances and everything to do with an internal standard that could never quite be satisfied, no matter how thoroughly the external world confirmed his talent. Understanding Michael Jackson's relationship with his father through this psychological lens does not diminish his accomplishments. If anything, it makes them more remarkable, evidence of what a person can build even while carrying an enormous, largely invisible internal weight that never seemed to fully lift, not during the years of the Jackson 5, not during the unprecedented success of Thriller, and, by most credible accounts, not even in the final months of his life as he prepared for what would have been his largest comeback yet. There is also a specific pattern worth examining in how Michael related to authority figures throughout his adult career, because it reveals just how deeply the dynamic with his father shaped his expectations of anyone occupying a position of power over his creative or professional life. Colleagues and collaborators across different decades described a man who could be extraordinarily deferential and eager to please certain figures in positions of authority, record executives, producers, directors, sometimes to a degree that surprised people who expected the world's biggest pop star to behave with more confidence in negotiations. At the same time, he could turn sharply guarded, even combative, the moment he sensed that same authority figure attempting to exert the kind of unilateral control his father once held over every aspect of his life and finances. This oscillation, eagerness to please paired with sudden defensiveness against control, maps closely onto the childhood pattern already described, a person conditioned early to seek approval from authority while simultaneously remaining hypervigilant against the possibility that the same authority could turn punishing or controlling without warning. It appeared in his business relationships, in his interactions with record labels, and by several accounts in his personal relationships as well, a persistent difficulty finding a stable middle ground between total deference and total guardedness, because that middle ground, ordinary trust extended gradually and adjusted based on actual behavior rather than fear, was never modeled for him consistently during the years when children typically learn it. Michael's two marriages, brief and heavily scrutinized as they both were, also invite consideration through this same psychological framework, though caution is warranted here given how little reliable, corroborated detail is publicly available about either relationship compared to the extensively documented childhood testimony discussed elsewhere in this account. What can be said with reasonable confidence, based on public reporting and Michael's own limited comments at the time, is that both relationships appeared to prioritize stability, family structure, and the desire for children over the kind of romantic intensity typically associated with celebrity marriages of that era. This pattern is consistent with someone whose deepest psychological need, formed decades earlier, revolved less around romantic passion and more around finally constructing the stable, protected family environment he felt had been denied to him as a child. Having children of his own appears, based on his own repeated public statements about fatherhood being the most meaningful part of his life, to have mattered to him far more than the marriages themselves, which suggests that even in his most intimate adult relationships, the organizing psychological force remained the same childhood wound driving so much of the rest of his life, a determination to build, by whatever means available to him, the secure, protected family structure that had been promised to him by the very family that raised him and never fully delivered. The concept of an alter ego or performance persona offers one more useful lens for understanding how thoroughly Michael's childhood shaped his adult psychology, because performers who develop under conditions of extreme early pressure often construct, consciously or not, a distinct performing self separate from their private identity, a self that can absorb scrutiny, criticism, and demand for perfection without the private self bearing the full weight of it directly. Michael's stage persona, meticulously crafted through costume, movement, and vocal choices refined across decades, functioned in some respects as exactly this kind of protective construction, a version of himself capable of enduring the extraordinary, unrelenting public scrutiny that came with global fame precisely because it had, in effect, been trained into existence under similarly unrelenting scrutiny from childhood onward. The difficulty, as many performers who rely heavily on this kind of persona eventually discover, is that the boundary between the performing self and the private self can become increasingly difficult to maintain over time, particularly for someone whose private self was never given adequate space to develop fully in the first place. Interviewers and biographers who spent time with Michael away from the stage frequently described someone who seemed genuinely uncertain, at times, about which version of himself he was presenting in a given moment, a soft-spoken, almost childlike private manner that some observers found endearing and others found difficult to reconcile with the confident, precise command he displayed on stage. That uncertainty is not simply an eccentric personality quirk. It is consistent with what psychologists would expect from someone whose authentic private identity was never permitted the ordinary developmental space most children receive, replaced instead, from a very young age, by a performing identity that had to be flawless in order to be safe. None of this is offered as an excuse for the discipline itself, and it would be a serious misreading of the available evidence to conclude that abuse should be understood as a reasonable or acceptable path toward producing talent, no matter how extraordinary the eventual outcome. Countless children endure similarly severe treatment and produce no comparable artistic achievement at all, simply additional suffering with no redemptive counterweight attached to it. A reminder that whatever correlation existed between Michael's specific childhood and his specific talents was never a guaranteed or reliable formula, only one particular painful and largely unrepeatable outcome among countless others that a similar upbringing might just as easily have produced instead. Michael Jackson's genius belonged to him, to his own natural gift and his own relentless work ethic as an adult, refining that gift long after childhood had ended, not to the belt his father held during rehearsals, and it does a disservice to both the art and the man to suggest otherwise. What the psychological history does offer, more usefully, is a fuller, more honest account of what it actually costs a child to be shaped this precisely, this early, by fear rather than security, an account that complicates the tidy, inspirational version of his biography that still circulates most widely, the one that treats extraordinary success as proof that whatever came before it must, on balance, have been worthwhile. Michael Jackson's own life, examined closely and honestly across the full record of interviews, testimony, and behavior he left behind, suggests he never fully believed that trade had been worthwhile himself, no matter how many times the outside world tried to convince him it had been, and no matter how many decades he spent, on stage and off, trying to reconcile the two irreconcilable truths that defined nearly everything about who he became, that he was both one of the most gifted performers his father's discipline ever helped produce, and one of the loneliest, most quietly wounded children that same discipline ever left behind, two facts that never stopped existing simultaneously for the whole of his extraordinary and unfinished life. Perhaps that duality is the truest inheritance Joe Jackson actually passed down to his son, more lasting than any single royalty check or contract negotiated on his behalf in childhood. Not simply talent, and not simply trauma, but the specific, painful entanglement of the two, a psychological inheritance that could never be spent, refunded, or set aside, only carried, performance after performance, decade after decade, in front of audiences who mostly saw only the polish and rarely asked what it had cost to produce it so consistently. Michael tried, in his own way, to interrupt that inheritance before it could pass any further, building a childhood at Neverland he never had, raising his own children with a gentleness his father never modeled, speaking publicly, however uncomfortably, about fear his father spent decades denying ever existed. Whether he fully succeeded in breaking the pattern is a question his own children, now adults, are perhaps better positioned to answer than anyone examining the story from the outside. What remains certain, documented across 50 years of interviews, testimony, and a body of work studied and imitated around the world, is that Michael Jackson understood, long before most audiences were willing to, that genius and wound can share the exact same origin point, and that no amount of applause, however sustained, however global, ever fully answered the question his childhood first raised, whether a person shaped this thoroughly by fear could ever truly believe, in the quiet moments, when the cameras stopped rolling, that he was already enough, exactly as he was, without a single flawless performance required to prove it.